Okay, clauses. A clause is a group of words that has a subject and a verb in it. Okay, it's like a phrase in that it's a group of words, but it's not like a phrase because a phrase doesn't have a subject and a verb. It has a subject, or it has a verb, or it has neither, but it doesn't have both. But a clause does. A clause always has both. There's two main types of clauses. The first main type is an independent clause, and that's the main type, really. I mean, that's the type that can stand all by itself. It can be its own sentence. All right, like the doctor held the baby very gently. It's a complete thought. It's an independent clause. Think independence. If you forget, if it's independent, it can stand by itself, right? Or if you want to think figuratively, people or clauses that are independent don't need any other clause to help it out to make a complete sentence. It is already a complete thought. Every sentence must have a complete thought. Every sentence must have an independent clause. There's the other type of clause, the other main type of clause, and that's a dependent clause. So a dependent clause is also known as a subordinate clause. Subordinate is a better word, I think, because sometimes people confuse the words independent and dependent. When teachers are saying dependent and independent all the time, sometimes the students don't hear which one they say because they sound so similar, and they mean the opposite, kind of, because in means not dependent. Dependent means subordinate, so independent means not subordinate. Not just, you want to think of it as it can stand by itself, but anyway, I just want to make sure we're using subordinate as our word instead of dependent. Okay, so this clause here, because the doctor held the baby very gently, that's not a complete thought. It would be without the subordinating conjunction, because, let's take that out. The doctor held the baby very gently. Now that's a complete thought. We just saw that up top. But if we add the subordinating conjunction, because, or whatever subordinating conjunction works, then it makes this incomplete. It needs an independent clause to go with it. Because the doctor held the baby very gently, comma, the baby stopped crying. Now there's the rest of the sentence. That's an independent clause. You can have a dependent as long as it's joined with an independent correctly. Okay, so we have punctuation patterns when we use independent and dependent in the same sentence also. And we will go ahead and we'll get into that. Basically, most of the time, if we start with if we start with a dependent clause, it's not a complete thought, right? And we go into the independent clause, which is a complete thought. We're going to pause, sort of like pausing for effect. We're going to pause before the independent clause. It's like the complete thought. We're saying, grammatically, we're saying, okay, I'm announcing here, or letting you know with a little space, little pause, that there's a big thought coming up. Grammatically speaking, the independent clause is the biggest and most important thought. Realistically, the other clause is usually pretty important as well, maybe more important. But grammatically, you have a main thought and an incomplete thought. So we use the comma before the main thought. Okay? But if you had the sentence the other way around, let's say we wanted to start with the baby stopped crying because the doctor held the baby very gently. Or the baby stopped crying because the doctor held it very gently. If we started with the independent clause, we would not put a comma before this dependent or subordinate clause. My theory is that we're not pausing and emphasizing something that's an incomplete thought. We're only pausing before the complete thoughts. All right? And that's a rule of thumb. It's not 100% of the time, and I'll go over which ones soon enough. I'll go over which ones are exceptions to the punctuation rule, and there's a better rule for this, but a more surefire rule to say when you get commas to offset a subordinate clause that comes at the end of the sentence. But for the most part, if you have something that starts with which or who, that is going to be a non-essential subordinate clause that does get offset with commas, usually. Okay? So let's take a look at just these two on the next page. All right, so this one is just joining two independent clauses with a coordinating conjunction. But this is a who clause. Usually the who clause gets offset with a comma right there. In fact, I would say we do that on this one too. If you offset who clauses and which clauses, clauses that start with who or which, like this one, if you offset it with a comma every time, you're probably going to get your punctuation correct about 90% of the time. They're saying this one is not offset with a comma, but most of the time a who clause is. So anyway, that should be about good for clauses. Good luck.